Good afternoon, our dear viewers of Civic Space TV. We are back, and this time round, we have enhanced our panel to meet the demands of a very special day that is coming, the International Day of Democracy. Democracy is a fairly well-sold word or theme. One would imagine that after very many years of advocacy and action, that it is something obvious. But when we look around us, we realize that not as much. There are so many people who style themselves as advocates of democracy. There are so many people leaders who style themselves as Democrats. Some countries have even carved names out of the word democracy. The question is there substance in this democracy? And so today we bring you a special edition in commemoration of the International Day of Democracy, which is on the 15th day of this month, September. And we have brought a panel that is as diverse as it is deep to help us answer these questions. What is democracy? How far has the country and the world generally moved in this journey of democracy? There are some voices suggesting that maybe some societies are not made for democracy. Maybe democracy is being imposed by some people and some societies. All these questions are going to be answered today. And on my extreme right is Mr. Godber Tumushabe, I believe a fair face and voice to many of us. Mr. Godber Tumushabe is the Executive Director of Bireete. I don't know whether they are still operating or not. Discussion on democracy.
Why don't you know?
It's a pleasure to have you, Godber.
Maybe a small correction, Abu.
Yes.
Actually, my position at Bireete is Associate Director.
Okay.
We don't have the big titles of Executive Director. We decided to leave those ones for Sarah and the rest.
Okay. Trust Godber to always have a fresh perspective. We are very glad to have you.
Thank you.
On board. Next to him is Mr. Robert Kigongo. We have hosted him here before. He's a champion of SDGs. Robert, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Yes, and the ones with the big titles.
Yes.
I might consider that as an attempt to shrink my space.
Yes, but Sarah Bireete is the Executive Director this time round. We are not shy about it. The Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Governance. And yeah, a fairly common voice on this platform. Sarah, it's always a pleasure to have you on this show.
Thank you, Abu.
And we have a special guest, Dr. Brian Warby. I hope I got the pronunciation right. I've been practicing.
It's perfect.
Yes, Dr. Brian Warby is a professor of political science who specializes in politics of global economics. And we think that he's going to deepen our conversation because he has written several books, book chapters, essays on the topic we are discussing, but also on foreign direct investment, which is a very hot topic when you're discussing democracy. He has also written and published on female empowerment, and has also published on cash transfer schemes. This was a very curious one for me. Personally, I'm going to learn about these cash transfers. Cash transaction is a subject of democracy in this country, and so we are going to hear. But he's in Uganda as a Fulbright scholar. I know that many of us have heard about Fulbright, a quite prestigious fellowship through the U.S. Department of State. And while here, he's affiliated to the Department of Political Science at Makerere University. And so without much ado, you can see that we are very heavy. Our panel is very heavy today. And as I told you, we are going to learn and we are going to engage. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Godber Tumushabe, to just help us put in perspective, what is democracy? Sometimes we think it's obvious, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, thanks very much, Abu, and delighted to be here. The concept of democracy is definitely an old concept. You can actually trace it back from the great philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and then the 18th century philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, wrote extensively on these concepts, and particularly democracy. In essence, what you are talking about here is the freedom of people to be able to determine their destiny. And therefore, democracy is the configuration of all those actions and all those platforms through which people are able to express themselves. In the contemporary discourse, we look at the different freedoms that have been articulated in many constitutions around the world. The freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, all kinds of different freedoms as we know them. Then, because of the representative nature of democracy, essentially having grown from the Greek communities, the Greeks normally used to have democracy in form of like village assemblies. So everybody would come together to be able to deliberate and make a decision on how society is governed and what needs to be done. But then, of course, as society became complex, populations became bigger, then it became difficult to get everybody to be part of the decision-making process. And therefore, the whole system of representative government emerged. And in that case, then you begin to look for leaders or representatives. So the whole concept of elections emerged. And elections become part of the architecture of democracy. Okay. Now, the important point here to note is that elections in the contemporary discourses should be looked at as a process. In most cases, most governments now have reduced elections to a one-day event where you go to the polling station and vote. Sometimes you don't know who is even counting your votes. You don't know who is announcing the votes. But elections in the real sense of democracy involves the process of empowerment, that the population, the citizens are empowered to be able to make decisions that are informed. That's why even when you look at the Ugandan constitution, there are specific provisions to do with civic education and agencies of government given mandate and responsibility to do civic education. The civic education is that process that then empowers the citizen to be able to make informed decisions and choices. So you have that process. You want to look at the voters register. So you look at the credibility of the process. I think the challenge that we have right now, especially as a continent, on this continent, the challenge that we have is the fact that these growing dictatorships, or the better word is to call them quasi-democracies. You say they have reduced democracy to a one-day event where you are going to the polling station to vote. And that is the dilemma that we have, even for when we say, we are celebrating the Democracy Day. I think that's a huge dilemma.
Okay, I'll be coming back to you, but thank you for starting from the fundamentals. But allow me now to go to Sarah. Sarah, from what Godber has given us, I've heard Western scholars, he has mentioned Western societies, and he's even going into the Constitution saying that there is a bit of civic, sensitization. Doesn't that lend credence to the idea that democracy is not an organically acquired value in our societies, and therefore maybe the challenges we have? What is democracy in our setting as a country and as a continent?
In addition to what Godber has said, really democracy in simple terms means people participation in their governance and their development. So when you take it as people participation being central, but there are also other principles of democracy, including rule of law, including inclusion in economic development, and the other aspects as contained in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Convention on Economic and Social Rights, including the rights of minority groups and indigenous groups. But in our context, people seem to say democracy is an imported concept. But when you go back to our traditional society setup, we had entrenched democracy through cultural leadership. Our societies were democratic. A king would never take a decision unless the people are consulted and unless it's endorsed by the assembly that he was governing with, which was like a governing council or a parliament. So what is imported? What is imported? There is nothing imported. But when people have fall short of the standards of democracy, then they tend to dismiss it as a colonial concept, as a foreign agenda, as an imported agenda, and this is common in Africa. But Professor will share with us what happens in other countries. But in our setup, the leaders that fall short, then they tend to dismiss even a concept of human rights as being foreign. How can human rights be foreign? The rights you are born with, how can they be foreign? How can inclusion in economic development be a foreign concept? Then who should be involved? So the people need to understand that the leaders that propagate these concepts have simply a foreign shot, and they want a cover-up for their shortfalls. But democracy is indigenous.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And that possibly transitions me to you, Professor, now. You are a scholar in political science, and I can see now that you're engaging globally. So part of what you could have observed here is that many times when our governments, the way she's describing them, fall short, they either denounce the value of democracy, or sometimes they even point to the faults. For example, in the United States of America, when maybe protesters are beaten, something comes out and says, you see, even the models you're referring to are not performing as well. And so from the perspective of an academic and someone who comes from a country that has stood as a model for democracy in the world, maybe you could also help us.
Until Mr. Trump arrived.
Yeah, and these institutions were tested. Yeah. Maybe you could also give us a perspective on what is democracy, especially in the American society, for example. Do some of these questions also come up in the United States? What is democracy?
Yeah, so as a scholar, I think I have a different perspective maybe than many Americans do. I think for most Americans, when we talk about democracy, in their minds they imagine the American form of government. As a scholar, though, I would suggest that there is no perfect democracy. A perfect democracy doesn't exist.
And that also sometimes is used to justify the undemocratic tendencies outside, saying there's no perfect democracy. So I hope you qualify it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister for the United Kingdom during World War II, was a vocal advocate for democracy, and he very famously said one time that democracy is the worst form of government other than every other form we've tried. In other words, democracy has its problems, and maybe we'll talk about that later. Yes. However, when we talk about empowering people, having a government that represents the interests of the individuals in that country, we have never found a form of government that is more effective than democracies. Now, again, when we say democracy, we need to be careful not to fall into the trap of imagining the American form of government or the British form of government or some other specific form. A democracy really is a much more loose idea. A democracy, I would suggest, is simply a government that is responsible to the people that it governs. And generally, that's through elections. And when you have elections where the people can vote and throw elected officials out of office, when they're dissatisfied. Replace them with a new candidate, and those elected officials have to answer to the people that they represent. That, for me, is the beginning of democracy. So that could follow the American form of government, but it doesn't have to follow the American form of government. And I think this is exactly what Sarah was saying with traditional leadership, even in Africa. It was not the American form of government, but it was, in fact, democratic in many ways.
Thank you. Now to you, Robert. So we have heard what democracy is. I think we are starting to understand what is meant by democracy. And as a young person who lives in Uganda, we have heard the leaders of this country say that, you know, they fought for democracy, and some of them even suggest that our problem is too much democracy and too much freedom. And yet you hear also voices like Sarah's saying that, you know, the space is shrinking, we are moving southwards. Would you help us now start to, you know, I want at this point the rubber to meet the tarmac and ask the question of democracy in Uganda. Are we a democracy? How are we doing?
The international of democracy comes at a time when there is less trust in public authorities, when there is literally no trust. That's what I can confirm. You've seen the space of civic engagement and education, it has been cramped down. SDG 16 addresses democracy as a bedrock or as a rock for peace, justice for all, and strong institutions. And the action targets are meant to protect democratic institutions like rule of law, which can ensure justice for all. We've seen in this country in the previous election where young people who had dissenting views had to be taken to jails without even a fair trial. And this is what we are addressing. SDG 16.5 also addresses meaningful participation of everybody without leaving anybody behind.
Maybe you can help us break down what you mean by SDG. So some viewers may be
SDG is Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them, but on this particular day of the International Day of Democracy, we are focusing on SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And it's meant to protect democratic institutions like political parties, electoral bodies, and the government entities that are leading these aspirations. However, we emphasize that these aspirations and values of democracy should not only be of lip service, but they must reflect in communities. They must be addressed in the true definitions, and they must reflect in our societies. As young people in the previous election, we faced the roughest time in history of Uganda. Many of them, especially from the National Unity Platform, who expressed dissenting desires to have change, ended up in prisons. And this is what we are totally against. We are calling upon governments to listen to these voices that are yearning for change and create dialogue and spaces, meaningful spaces, where we can air out these views. Democracy cannot flow or cannot prosper if there is a crampdown on civic space. It cannot even literally exist. Governments, especially our government, must let civil societies do their work so that they do civic engagement and so on and so forth. At the Youth Coalition, we share the same values and commitment as the United Nations call to address the challenges of democracy. We also share values of empowering young people to step up into spaces. In the previous elections, I've seen young people stepping up in electoral positions to take up their space. And these young people must be listened to. Their space must be safe because they are rightly demanding for their space. Today, young people are on the front lines and in the headlines, purposely because we've empowered them, we've encouraged them.
Thank you, Robert. Sounds promising, but also depressing at some point. But let me go to Godber. So you did say that essentially, what I could deduce from your submission is that essentially, democracy is about the freedom for citizens to self-determine. And I'm wondering what then you say to people who argue that there are some societies that don't have that capacity, where the citizens are peasants, they are, you could say backward, you know, such words are used, or civically incompetent, and therefore it looks like some need some groups of people to think for them and decide for them what's good, because they're incapable of making right choices. What do you say to this?
No, I actually think it's really not about, you know, people thinking for someone. I think, first of all, you need societies progress. How do they progress? And societies will progress politically, economically, socially, and otherwise. You know, these powerful words that are thrown around called transformation. Yeah. So, you know, you can have a society that is economically transformed, or politically transformed, or socially transformed, and all that means that the structure of society is changing. Their value systems are changing. Their different capacities and competencies are changing. Now, the democracy or the freedom makes all that happen. That it's normally when you look at some of these countries that are dictatorships, some of them transformation happens and then it leaves many others out. But in many others, the transformation will not happen because the population is not able to engage in different aspects of life. As Sarah said, even when we say participation, in most cases, people then reduce that political participation. But actually, participation essentially means more than political participation. So you're talking about political, you're talking about participation in the economy, you're talking about, I come from the field of environmental law. That's one field that actually picked up a lot on participation in terms of people being, you know, the understanding is that when people participate in making decisions regarding the environment, then you are able to get better compliance in terms of achieving your environmental objectives. So the participation becomes a very important dimension of democracy. But the point I wanted to emphasize is that I think that there are two things that I want to emphasize. One is that in most cases you find that there are leaders who transform their societies. So if you go to the US, they will tell you about George Washington, James Madison, and others. There are certain things they did after the Civil War to get the US to start building this democracy infrastructure that can withstand even reckless guys like Trump. Yeah, I imagine if Trump was in Africa, in an African country, I think he would have left the entire country completely destroyed. Yeah, so they have been able to build pillars in terms of the legal regime, in terms of institutions, in terms of the financial architecture, in terms of the accountability frameworks. They have been built, and so these I call transformative leaders.
So if I can just engage on that, actually the idea is that such leaders should not be interrupted by democracy.
No,
because exactly.
No, you see that's where we get it wrong, because you see a transformative leader will respect their people. In fact, their mental programming is that we want to do this for society. They put their own interests in check and do things that work for society. So in other words, if Abu was given 5 years of the presidency in Uganda, let's assume you have only 5 years. So transformative leaders are looking at, say, what kinds of things do I build that create resilience within the population to be able to do bigger things, to be able to think bigger, to be able to imagine. Because you see, like in Uganda now, the president and NRM group says, oh, we are creating transformation. But essentially, if you think about it, you realize that the things they do, the net effect of the things they do is that it has lowered the imagination of everybody. Your imagination is lowered to the basics, sometimes basics of survival. So you have these transformative leaders that help build the infrastructure for democracy, the infrastructure for success. Now, you can juxtapose that with the transactional leaders who basically are scattered all over this continent. Everything they do is a transaction. Yeah? So even when they do the right thing, they are doing it because they expect a payback. So someone will come and say, oh, we want to promote the youth in business. So let's create a youth livelihood fund. But actually, or we create the mioga here, the money was disbursed immediately after elections. And it was actually held on the bank accounts. So the guys who were expecting money, they know it's there on the accounts, but they can't access it.
Actually, Mr. Godber,
yeah.
When this money was delivered, for example, I come from Greater Masaka region, whereby the other groups of youth thought that subscribed to the ruling government, they thought, oh, this is an appreciation for us to vote the ruling government. Yeah, so they went with that kind of mind.
The timing, the delivery was basically communicated that. But I'm saying this is a transaction. These are transactional leaders, and they cannot build for the future. They can only build for the short term. So the last point I wanted to emphasize is that democracy embodies the concept of freedom. Yeah? That's why you have democracies really paying attention to all these freedoms, because it embodies the element of freedom. What most dictatorships don't know is that when people are not free, you've reduced their capacity to be able to think and act big.
But that's their intention.
Actually, that's their intention. Yeah, but in a democracy, I think that people who study development know that freedom is what unleashes the ingenuity and the creativity of a people. Yeah, it's that freedom that you can think, you can act, you can create without fear of restraint. So all these countries, I always argue that all these countries, Uganda and all these banana republics across the continent, are suffering from transformation because they have created a situation that oppresses you as a person and limits your imagination. So I want Ugandans and other people to begin to think about democracy as freedom, to be able to do things, to be able to choose your leaders, to be able to imagine things that are possible.
Yeah, we are going to probe what that freedom really entails, and I'll be coming to you, Sarah, for that. But maybe let me start with Professor. He's talking about, like sort of unleashing people's ingenuity and letting them do what they like. And what I'm hearing there, liberal ideas and ideas of free market. So democracy at times is also tied with free market ideas. In your earlier submission, you seem to suggest that there is no model for democracy. Every society could come up with its own model. And so there are some countries which are saying democracy actually impedes development, and that for them, they choose economic transformation for their societies rather than emphasizing the ideas that come with democracy, as Sarah told us, some of them which have to do with human rights, some of them which have to do with free markets. What do you say to this? How does democracy play out with economic development? Are they complementary? Are they counter to each other? Is one a prerequisite for the other? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, and it's something that a lot of experts, policymakers, politicians, and scholars have tried to find an answer to for quite a long time, and there's this debate going on all over the world. And the first point that I need to make is when we talk about democracy or we talk about capitalism, free markets, we tend to imagine that either you are a democracy or you are not a democracy. And of course, that's not the case. You could be very democratic or pretty democratic or sort of democratic, maybe less, right? It's this spectrum. And the same is true of markets. Some markets are more liberal and some are less liberal. You could have a liberal market and an autocratic government, although when we have democracies, it's difficult to have a democracy without having a more liberal economy, because the people want to be able to innovate. They want to be able to apply themselves, and as I said before, the essence of democracy is that the government responds to the people. Yeah. Now, on this question of economic outcomes, we can find many historical examples where autocrats, like dictators, came to power and were able to bring about tremendous economic growth in a short period of time. It's possible, and it happens. However, if we look at really long time trends, if we look instead of 5 years of economic growth under a dictator, or even maybe 10 or 15 years of economic growth, if we look at 50 years or 100 years, we start to see a much clearer pattern, which is that democracies, more democratic governments, bring about much greater economic growth over long time periods. Yeah, so in the short time period, it's certainly possible that a dictator can make big changes quickly. But those changes will stop at some point because the dictator wants to stay in power. Right? And with the democracy, it's constantly changing and adapting to the changing markets, the changing social interests, civic organizations of the people. And as people, we want an economy that helps us to have a better life. Yeah, so to answer your question in just one sentence, I would say in the long term, democracy is necessary for a long-term successful economy.
So where does that then leave those who argue that possibly because, especially in Africa, we have peasant societies, that there is need to employ some autocratic methods in the short term to sort of bring the citizens to speed, and then they can have democracy. Has that worked anywhere? It doesn't make any sense.
Has it worked? I can't think of an example where that has worked well. But when, as an American, I'm most familiar with the American democracy. When democracy began to emerge in the United States, the majority of people were peasants. And most Americans in the 1700s could not read. They were not well educated. If they had any formal education, it was little. So I would say, no, it's not necessary for the citizens to be well educated or to be wealthy. It's only necessary that the citizens, the voters, have access to information about the policies of the government and the elected officials. I would say that's the only thing that's necessary in terms of information or education, is that the voters, the citizens, know what exactly they're voting for or against.
Thank you very much. And that sends me to Sarah. Sarah, you can tell that so far a very good case has been made for democracy and freedom, almost as a prerequisite for then the other cycles of development. And one of the words that has come through prominently is freedom, freedom. You will realize that, for example, the managers of this country, they actually don't make cases against freedom. In fact, they style themselves as freedom fighters. And they will tell you that we have put up a constitution, there are institutions, the corrupt are often arrested and tried and charged. But they say that does not mean, for example, you have to leave terrorists. Earlier on I was talking about young people who are arrested. You cannot leave terrorists, or that, in essence, that freedom is not absolute anywhere in the world. So could you help us maybe now, in definite terms, enable us to know when we say freedom, what exactly do we mean? Is there a limit? And where are we as a country or even continent in that respect?
Yeah, before I answer your question on freedom, I think it's important to underscore the fact that democracy is expected to produce transparent, responsive, and accountable leaders. So once you have these leaders that are responsive to the demands of the people they lead, then you have the wishes and aspirations of the people as a driving voice for what the decisions leaders take and implement. So once you have that concept as a foundation, then the freedoms, which include freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of the place, access to information, freedom, the economic, freedom to exercise your professions and earn from them, a right to life. The freedoms as embedded really in our chapter 4 of the Constitution, which is a direct copy and paste of the Universal Declaration on fundamental rights and freedoms. Then we have the civil and political rights, which are also embedded in our Constitution, and the economic rights, which are from Article 4 to 42 of our Constitution. So once you have these freedoms properly exercised by the citizens, which makes them informed, which makes them free to make decisions as to who should govern them and how they should be governed, and you are listening to them. You have a bottom-up approach to what informs the decision that are taken at the top. Then freedoms translate into democracy. But once you do not have the bottom-up approach of citizens' voices, demands, wishes, and aspirations as a driving force for leaders, then the freedoms cease to influence and empower democracy and drive democracy and involvement in a country. But we know there are limitations to these freedoms. For example, for the common good, in the interest of security, as provided for in our Article 44 of the Constitution. But there are also those freedoms that cannot be derogated from, even in situations of emergency, including a right to a fair trial, a right to life, freedom from torture. So, do we have respect for those concepts in our democracy, for example? I do not think so. Kigongo was talking of youth and how they were tortured, abducted, tortured, and what was their crime? Killed. Participation in their democracy, exercising a right on how they want to be governed and who should govern them, was the crime that led to loss of lives, that led to torture, that led to kidnapping. Some people are still missing, as we debate on this Democracy Day. People are still missing, and their crime is participation in their governance. So once you have this, then I don't know what freedoms you're talking about. We as civic actors, as much as we are empowered by virtue of us being citizens of this country, but also by the Constitution, the kind of separation we go through as civic leaders, I think we need to, I hope that at the end of this debate, we shall be able to say these are standards for a country to claim to be a democracy. And this is how we score our own country. Yeah, because I think that is important.
What is the yardstick? How do you measure?
Yes. Because standards of democracy are known and are clear. Main 5 standards: citizens' participation, rule of law, inclusion, fundamental rights and freedoms. And the 5th one, I think, is decision making. No, freedom, of course, freedom of media, expression, and association. So these are the 5 key standards where we can say, how do we score? For example, freedom of association, assembly, expression, and access to information, which is a driving factor for citizens' participation in their democracy.
For example, that on the freedom of media, I've heard the managers argue that when they came to power, there was one radio station. Now there are hundreds. The regime, the current
of the country.
regime, yes. they say, for example, in media, that there was only one radio station, one TV station, and now there are hundreds.
You see, we cannot measure freedom of media as expression based on the number of radio stations. During the last elections, where it was practically impossible to have big gatherings of people because of COVID pandemic, we had our election categorized as scientific in quotes, elections, because the major campaigning was supposed to be via media and digital platforms. So that is mass media as well as new media, which is social media. So after this categorization, the standard operating procedures or guidelines were issued by Electoral Commission. So then media wondered how they were supposed to be the main channel for campaigning and making sure that the citizen makes an informed choice and the contenders have access to citizens to impart their knowledge and sell their campaign agenda to enable these citizens choose who they think has the best program for them. The media put their proposals on how they thought they would relay that election campaigning program, and nothing was done. We saw presidential campaigns being stopped from going on televisions and radios. We saw, a partisan approach, allowing some people to have access to media and others don't have. We saw journalists beaten as they tried to cover some contenders. We saw all this, abuse that happened on that simple right of freedom of association, expression, and access to information in an election amidst COVID pandemic where public gatherings are not advised. And maybe it's also important to inform our viewers that if we decided to publicize this debate and have the 20 people as guided by Minister of Health, then maybe this debate could have been blocked. That is how difficult it is to enjoy a simple right that drives citizens' participation in their governance in this country. Even simple gatherings are problematic. Just on Friday, we had a symposium, a mentorship program at Makerere University for female leaders. They had invited 20 people physically, as guided by the Ministry of Health. We were 5 facilitators, 2 moderators, a chief guest, and a few other members of the guild. But the president closed the whole university, through police. The whole university was closed, blocking a simple event of mentorship of female leaders at the university. So what kind of freedoms are we talking about in this country?
Thank you, Sarah. We are laughing not because it's funny, but maybe it's a way of coping. Yes, but Robert, so on this show, actually today, the question we are trying to answer is, how do we make democracy about the people? How do we make democracy? Because from the submissions that I've made, it's clear that democracy is about participation, contestation, inclusion. So possibly at this point, we have heard what democracy is. We have tried to assess where Uganda is standing. Doesn't look very nice. But possibly maybe we can now engage with how can we, get there? How can we move our democracy from where we are seeing it now to where it's supposed to be? And I know that there are so many stakeholders and roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders, so we could maybe engage with some at a time. But with your background of SDGs, you know where to start from.
Thank you, moderator. We should all know, dear viewers, that democracy is not a favor, it's a right. Once that sinks into our heads, I think we shall continuously demand for it, not just a handful of people that are demanding for it, but it's our sole responsibility collectively to demand for democratic tendencies. That's how democracy will be about people. We shouldn't wait for one occupier to choose which way we should go to have democracy in our country. But it's we the citizens, you who is listening to me, that should ask for this because it is your right. It is not just a favor. And also the institutions that are supposed to deliver democracy, whoever is employed there must know that employing you is not a favor because you went to school, you are a Ugandan, you have a right to this job. If you are employed, do the necessary job. Do what is stipulated for you so that you can deliver what is meant to be delivered. As young people, we've stepped up. Our voices are everywhere. However, the voices are suffocated. The voices are suffocated by the entrenched, occupation and the systems that are everywhere. You all know in the previous campaigns, internet was switched off at the exact hour, at the exact moment when we needed democracy tendencies to be delivered. Young people, we use internet as a channel to communication, as a channel to free expression. That's where we express our ideas. Actually, some of the dissenting views were calling it ENSCO, that it was there in school. So what happened? The ENSCO was slashed. That day it was switched off. And leaders must know that it's not a favor to deliver democracy. Because first of all, democracy will save us from future crises that are bound to happen. We are only nurturing hatred, we are nurturing bitterness. We may think on the surface, oh, we've overcome this. You have the immediate score now, but what happens in the future? You are only nurturing. The question is, you who is blocking democracy, after you are not here, do you really wish your family to live in exile? Is this the country that you want? I think we should have what we call self-censorship, and we should listen to our consciousness and deliver what is rightly belonging to the people. As young people, we've stepped up, at least we've amplified our voices. We've made it our own. It's not like we are waiting for anybody to deliver us. I think young people have taken up this trail of making democracy about them. And this is a wonderful gesture of progress. But to institutions that are supposed to deliver democracy, the political parties, there should be meaningful participation at all levels. From the top, I'm talking about a political party where internal mechanism of democracy must start from. We should have meaningful participation, contestation. People must be able to choose whom they want, not just to point out or to headhunt for who should spearhead this. As long as someone shares the same values and commitment, I think we can engage them. Answering your question, the SDGs talk about empowering people to take up their roles. But how can we empower people when there is no safe space? I'm talking about civic space. This Democracy Day comes at a time when injustices are going unaddressed. Civic space is shrinking. So what do you expect for us to? But as citizens, we should step up our voices and demand for it because there is nothing for us without us. We have youth representatives, but literally they are not actually representing us. So it's we, the local people that should step up, amplify our voices and demand for. Then the authorities or the authoritarians, stroke occupier, will definitely give in to what we are demanding for. But if you are saying, how can democracy be about people? In our context, I don't see that happening. Unless you, the citizen, you is viewing, you is listening, steps up and demand for rightly belongs yours. I appreciate young people who are on the front line and who are in the headlines every day, advocating for these very voices and these changes. Let these anticipations, let these values reflect in our communities. And please avoid to be compromised in any way. Because if you have a voice of your generation out there and you accept to be compromised, you are compromising your future, yourself.
But I hear you, making a call for people to rise up and speak up. And this was a very common call in the drum up to the elections. And one of the voices that I found very curious that came through were people who would come out, I even saw religious leaders doing so, and say, hey, you should not be misled young people. Those people calling you out to come out and die. And you people who are in the suits.
Die of what? COVID?
Die of the state brutality.
Yes, that's the point I wanted you to make.
Yes. So they are saying, please.
You don't die of, you are killed by.
Yes.
Killed by
But it seems like those who are making those voices have made peace with the state brutality. Now they are saying, please, don't try because you're going to die. Some insisted, and indeed, like Sarah said. So yes.
I think the way you are putting it is quite different. We are talking about, and I think as Brian, yes, as Brian said, you're talking about the spectrum. So at the upper limit, you have democratic free societies. At the lower limit, you have the absolute dictatorships. Yes. I would put countries like North Korea in absolute dictatorships. Yes. Along this pendulum, you have all these many variables and many situations. I think that one thing that people need to understand that dictatorship in most cases they are not like a package on the shelf which you go and pick and say, Uganda, we have a dictatorship. Dictatorships are built.
Color orange.
Yeah. So dictatorships are built. They build themselves over time. And in most cases, dictatorships build by destroying institutions of citizenship. Yeah? Because the institutions of citizenship are the true expressions of democracy, of freedom. As an individual, you have limitations. But when you are a community, when you are a civic institution, you have the power. You have the DNA that moves things. So if you think of Uganda, you can look at the last 35 years and you see how the regime has focused on destroying the institutions of citizenship. So you will see that they came and demobilized the cooperatives. Cooperatives were the fundamental institutions for economic organizing. Yes. Yeah? The economics of the population of the cities was built around cooperatives. Cooperatives, through cooperatives, you would do production, you would get inputs, you would get markets. At no point did my parents grow coffee and they have no market. Because Banyankore Kwetarana was always there. So the way we have Bugisu Cooperative Union, they're always there. So then the regime demobilized those institutions and they create fictitious institutions. So those groups you call circles, these are patronage networks that are dependent on the regime on handouts. So you'll go to the cultural institutions. So dictatorships will demobilize cultural institutions because cultural institutions give cultural expressions of the citizens. They also organize and mobilize and they have power. So that even when this regime said we are restoring kingdoms, they had to restore
exactly,
them as
because I was going to tell you that sounds quite contradictory because they chest thumbs.
Because you see, they bring them as patronage institutions. If you look at the restitution of traditional institutions legislation and then the laws that provide for payment of salaries and giving cars, and you're basically patronizing these institutions. They no longer represent the cultural expression of the citizens. They actually become part of enablers of the dictatorship. You know, I can talk about religion. I mean, you can see over time the religious institutions have been patronized because I've never understood why.
Except the Catholic Church.
No, even the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, I have actually explained that it's in traditional, and I hope I won't be crucified for this, but the Anglican Church in this country is a materialistic institution. The leaders in the Anglican Church like goods, they like things. Yeah, I have been studying this. Yes. I've been studying this. The first bishops to be given cars were from the Anglican Church.
And not through a formal structure. But
No, they are being handed over cars. But you see, the Anglican Church in this country is this, I think, second largest, yeah, after the Catholics. Yeah. So when you have all these Christians, it is only the church where you put a basket and Christians come and put money without even a budget. Yeah? So in other words, if a bishop or anybody in the church wanted a car, you can collect the money, you can buy a car.
Mr. Godber, I was always wondering, can't these bishops afford these pajeros that they are given as tokens?
So that's the point I'm making. So this is a materialistic institution, and the dictatorship will actually pick on that and use it to patronize it. The Catholic Church, this is a church that loves power, right from the Vatican. These are powerful people. And so that's why you find that in this government of ours, there are specific positions in the political makeup that it is rare to find that they are not given to Catholics. Yeah? So if you look at the political economy of organization of power here, you can begin to see that no, actually this probably is negotiated. Because why is it's consistent over time? And of course for the Islamic faith, I think a lot of the disorganization. I know that our brothers and sisters in the Islamic faith, the only time they talk to each other as a community is when they are meeting the president at State House. The moment they come out, then there's Chibuli, then there's Orid Kampala, then I think there's William Street. So you get the point. And so these institutions, once you demobilize the institutions of citizenship, you are building a dictatorship. There is no other way. I can end with one thing, which is about the tribes. Because this country, people have been traumatized by saying you are tribal, you are ethnic. But that's who we are. I mean, anybody who denies the fact that I am a Ugandan Munyankore, or Abu is a Ugandan Mugisu, yeah? I think that's living in denial. So what you have is that these institutions, these regions, for example, these tribes, the Banyankole, the Bagisu, the Kalamajong, the Acholis, the Banyoro, these are institutions of citizenship because there is collective self-determination of the Banyoro. I don't think that anybody should apologize for being a Munyoro, for being a Munyankore, because that's who we are as a society. But dictatorships will normally demobilize those groups because the collectives of citizens are the counterbalance to dictatorships. And in our particular case, you have seen how this regime has completely dismantled all these places. You have over 135 districts. So in fact, in my interactions with the public, there are only two formations that consider themselves as a community. The Acholis and the Baganda. It is very difficult to go to Ankole and you say the people saying we are Wanyankole. No, these ones are from Muntunga Mo, the other one from Mitoma, Chiruhura, you know, and you lose that collective.
Maybe that helps to build a nation. Shouldn't we be looking?
But you see, nations are built on pillars. So citizens' organizations are pillars of a democracy because they counterbalance power. They balance the power relationships. The moment you demobilize all these institutions, then you have weakened the democratic culture. Because, these institutions, whether they are economic, whether they are cultural, whether they are social, they are pillars around which you can build a democracy. Because democracy also means there is accountability.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Godber. The United Nations General Assembly in 2007, by consensus, came up with a resolution that led to the commemoration of the International Day of Democracy. In the words of the UN Secretary General, this is a day when we take stock of the status of democracy in the world and in our particular societies. That's what we are trying to do here. And so far we have understood what democracy is. We have tried to weigh and see where we are standing as a country, as a continent, as the world. Some things are a bit depressing, but when we come back, possibly we shall sound more optimistic and start to charter a way forward. So we are going to take a break. Stick with us. More is coming. Welcome back. I told you that when we come back, we shall sound more optimistic, and we are going to engage a higher gear, looking at the region and the globe. And I'm going to start with you, Sarah. The International Day of Democracy came 10 years after the Inter-Party Parliamentary Union, which is an international organization of parliaments, made what is called the Universal Declaration on Democracy. And so the UN picked up that effort, and it was made on the 15th September, and so the 15th September was declared as the International Day of Democracy, which for me speaks of the relevancy of sub-regional, regional, and even global organizations and initiatives in deepening democracy. And so starting in our own region here of the East African community, we are discussing Uganda, but we have to our neighborhood, South Sudan, we have Kenya, we have Tanzania, and we have Rwanda. And so what is the place for the sub-regional bodies? Because the body has a parliament, it has courts, it has a summit, which is more like a full government. Where is the place of this institution in deepening democracy?
You know, democracy has shared values. Shared values, or we can call them principles, of free and fair elections, rule of law, respect for human rights or human dignity, freedom of association, assembly, and expression, then access to information. So when you look at the regional international mechanisms, or the International Day of Democracy itself, it means that as citizens of the world, can we take stock of where we are in terms of these shared values and principles as actors on the world stage. So the East African community has principles in its preamble, the principles for the reestablishment of the community, because it's important maybe for the young people who are majority of citizens in this country to know that the community, the East African community, had collapsed in 1977 due to the democracy deficit. Yes. Yes, and democratic tendencies of the leaders led by Uganda then, and the disagreements with the leaders in Kenya and Tanzania at the time, and there was failure to build consensus, both in terms of cherished values, but also the economic principles of the community. So the reestablishment was envisaged to maybe to prevent another possible collapse. Although now many scholars have said this community needs to collapse, maybe in its current form, needs to collapse again, or is mature for collapse.
Or it has already collapsed.
Also, that is another possibility.
Yes.
because when you look at the principles of the community, democracy, human rights, free and fair elections,
People-centeredness.
yes, people-centeredness, private sector driven. When you look for the people in the current architecture or the current mechanisms, the people are being participated instead of participating and being the drivers of the community. When you look at basic principles like free movement of goods, people, goods and services, we have 3 closed borders in the community. So whereas you say that people should be free to move, trade, cooperate, to build the East African nation, you have the Rwanda border closed, so the people of Uganda and Rwanda cannot move to either country. You have the Rwanda-DRC border closed. The citizens of those 2 countries cannot freely move. And you have the Rwanda-Burundi border also closed. And the leaders at the top are talking of that they are ready for the East African Federation. So, so you
Actually,
wonder what kind of...
Actually, for the case of the Uganda-Rwanda border, it was closed when the president of Rwanda was the chairperson of the summit.
Of the community, yes. And this is
But
disagreement.
you can also add Uganda, South Sudan because of the insecurity along the
along
South
the
Sudan,
borders, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and now I think over time, the selfishness and hypocrisy of leaders at the East African level has completely cut out the citizen in participation in their governance at that level, but also their views, wishes, and aspirations have no space. I know the East African Court has tried on 2 occasions to pronounce themselves on the undemocratic tendencies in Uganda and Burundi, and also at one time closed Kenya's election because of the manner in which the East African representatives to the assembly were elected. But now it has become more of a mere tool because it is scared of when there's a contentious issue before the court, either there is no quorum of the court because the judges are supposed to be seconded by the member states, or it will say it has no jurisdiction on the matter. Yet the matter is rooted in a treaty itself. So it has become more of a toothless, kind of habitat at that level. But the mechanisms of the community that provide for citizens to participate, now the only people that go to East African engagements are civil servants. So the question that then would arise is, are civil servants representatives of the people? I know that we have a parliament, but the manner in which these MPs are elected does not allow for it's indirect by the member state parliaments, and also it has party, numerical strength. So if you have, for example, our ruling party dominates the East African Community Parliament by virtue of their numerical strength in our parliament. At least if we said members of parliament are elected through adult suffrage, and they should go and represent the people in electing who represents us in the East African Court, then we should remove that contestation of numerical strength to say before you even conduct elections. I think now NRM has 5 members. So it will take 5 slots in the East African community. So the rest of the 10 or 9 opposition MPs, parties, will then struggle and fight for the remaining 4 posts. Is that representative enough?
Yeah, is it not a plausible argument that the numerical strength of the National Assembly reflects the will of the people in that
If you have free and fair elections. If we had free and fair elections in this country, yes, it would reflect. But unfortunately, since independence, this country has never held any election that is regarded as free and fair and credible. So we cannot argue authoritatively that the outcome of exercise that is supposed to be an election He's a representative of people's will in this country.
The community is suffering the undemocratic tendencies of the member states.
Yes.
So it moves from...
Yes, but beyond that also it is shielding. And you know, the hypocrisy and transparency. It is like a talking crab. So if there is a problem in Uganda, you cannot have a president of Kenya taking a firm step and say, this is wrong. I want to compare the East African community with our immediate neighbor in West Africa, the ECOWAS and ECOMOG. We have seen the ECOWAS, the Economic Community for West African States, being a bit more authoritative and democratic in the way they deal with each other. There are several occasions.
It's not a bit more. ECOWAS is a functional regional organization.
Yes, I'm using that.
The EAC is a dysfunctional organization.
I think I can borrow that description. In West Africa, if a member state is violating the principles, the shared principles of the bloc, ECOWAS. Yes,
absolutely.
They sit down, they speak the truth, they don't speak with grass in their mouth. So they speak
Even I think the guys
truth.
of Ghana Conakry, they have been expelled from ECOWAS.
Yes. Yeah. And they also have a functional military arm that they can even deploy. Yeah. You know, if you are democratically, they can deal with you, either diplomatically, militarily, or otherwise. Yeah. By sanctioning you, by even fighting you practically. And Nigeria has played a bigger role on that. But in East Africa, we do not have a big brother of that caliber. I know that President Museveni claims to be a senior, maybe in terms of years, age and years in power, yes. But in terms of offering leadership on democracy, no. But unfortunately, even coming into the international community, we have the bigger blocks away from East Africa looking at Museveni as a pillar for stability, which is a very disturbing concept, but which has been bought by international community, that for you to have a stable Greater Lakes region, then you must have Museveni in power. And at times I wonder what they will do when God decides that his years are off.
God is not listening to you.
Let me come to you, Godber. Sarah has given us a perspective of the East African community, and I must say it does not look very attractive. So I'd like you to help us engage at now a regional level of the continent, the African Union and its attendant institutions. Where are they in these conversations? You have a Pan-African Parliament, you have the African Court, you have a Committee on Human Rights. All these institutions, when it comes to deepening democracy, where are they and how are we doing?
Yeah, no, just to re-echo and really add on Sarah's point about EAC and these regional blocks, I think that the ECOWAS and SADC have given us a glimpse of what regional groupings can do in terms of creating stability within the region. Because sometimes it is just a question of preemptive mechanisms that you know that in SADC, if you do certain things, the countries of SADC will not accept. Yeah? So there is a preemption. Now, in East Africa, it's really to whom it may concern. Yeah? So the countries in here have focused more, they are more internal, and then others have focused more on building their capacity to export conflict. That in most cases, some of these countries can actually export conflict. They always saw it happen in DRC.
I thought they export stability.
No, you see, you can't have dictatorships can't export stability, because what stability are you exporting? But essentially, just to go back to your point about the continent, I think by the end of the 1990s, it was so apparent and recognized by everybody that the African countries were failing at that time. They were looking for money to invest. And that's how then we ended up with the new Economic Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD. The adoption of NEPAD with leaders like Obasanjo, like Thabo Mbeki, like Museveni, and others leading I think there was, who was the guy in Brian Warby in Senegal. You know, these leaders almost presented a new perspective.
Prime Minister Tony Blair described them as a new breed.
No, that is the area group that crashed much earlier.
That one is-
The new breed of African leaders was the axis. I call it the Kigali, Kampala, Addis, Asmara axis. Yeah, those were the new breed of African leaders. And then within less than 10 years, they were fighting each other. So that crashed much earlier. But these other leaders, more senior, they really pushed for NEPAD. As part of NEPAD, the one important mechanism that had been created was the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, a PRM. That was supposed to be like the gold standard for adhering to good governance and economic principles. And then these leaders would assess each other on how far they were moving in terms of adhering to these principles. And essentially, as usual, eventually this degenerated into a ritual where, because you have these leaders coming to assess, Museveni's peers assessing Museveni, Museveni probably is in Rwanda assessing Kagame, Kagame is in Angola assessing Dos Santos. So basically it's a peer group. And I think that for me, from my experience, I have also learned that you cannot get a collection of dictators and say they are going to build democracy.
I should share with you a radical statement by a young Malema when he was still chairperson of the Youth League. He described the African Union as a club of dictators that share not, compare not.
That compare not. I think so. I actually think that he is right. Because one of the most disturbing things is that when NEPAD was being adopted, there were two, and because now we are talking, they are also talking about the Africa Free Trade Area.
Yes.
Huh? But you see, in 2000, there were two guys that attended the Abuja conference that adopted the Abuja Treaty, which was talking about Africa regional integration. Yeah? Obiang Nguema and Robert Mugabe were in the meeting in 1980. They agreed on all these things because NEPAD didn't really say anything new other than repackaging what was agreed. So 20 years later, they are seated in the same meeting agreeing. And probably now, 20 years later, the same guys, Museveni, Kagame, Paul Biya, Obiang Nguema, you know, all these guys, they are seated somewhere in Addis agreeing on the Africa Free Trade Area.
It's a photo movement.
Yeah. So essentially, the dysfunction of the African Union is rooted in the dictatorships of the member states. And you've seen the African Union actually get confused, even when they are coups. Because these dictators met and made a decree and said there should never be military coups. That's the decree. But you see, the military coups are normally against these dictators.
But also that's how they came to power.
And
So
that's how they
provoke
came
other
to power.
people.
Exactly. And that's how they came to power. Now, you saw when there was that modern version of a coup in Zimbabwe, the African Union was completely confused. So I think that as long as you don't have democracies on this continent that build, democracies of the type of Botswana, of South Africa, of Ghana, of Kenya. Those are the countries that should begin now to say we can now form an African Union. But these other guys, I don't think that it adds too much value. We are going to be fighting with them all the time. They are going to be fighting with their people all the time because their own there's no way they can promote democratic values and principles because those ones go against their own regime survival politics. And that's what you'll see. So groups like African Parliament, really they are of no consequence at all, other than creating a platform for people to get there and feel good. For countries like Uganda, you have an opportunity to send their people to, If you are a patronage system, you can, you send there so and so, send there this one.
And per diem.
Yeah, they add per diem. I mean, for an ordinary African, if there was no African parliament, what exactly would you lose?
Thank you very much. Dr. Brian. As you can tell, there are no kind words in East Africa, no kind words at the continent. But you're a political scientist who specializes in global economics. I find that interesting because as I ask you to give us a perspective of the global dynamics in this discussion of democracy, I know that it also has very serious economic undertones. In Uganda, for example, just a few months ago, some citizens were trying to petition the IMF not to extend a loan to Uganda. The same conversation has been happening in Kenya. And so you could help us paint a picture. First of all, where is the place for and actually the day we are discussing came into effect as a result of a UN General Assembly resolution. So where is the place for global players? And the politics, actually your specialization is interesting because it is the politics of global economics. So you're the best person to help us understand their political role, but also the economic undertones that keep coming through.
Yeah, so that's a complicated question, I think, to answer. These global institutions, global organizations like the IMF or the World Bank or the United Nations even, the institutions themselves end up taking on their own identity. And the people who work for the institutions or represent those institutions, to some degree, they have to adopt that identity in order to function as an employee or a representative of that institution. So if we're talking about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF has its mission, right? It has its goals that are stated and written down. And the actions that it takes as an institution are efforts to advance those goals. However, the IMF, global organizations or international organizations, whether it's the East African Community or it's the United Nations, they're also made up of separate individual countries. And those countries don't always share the same interests. Yeah, so if we're talking about the IMF, it is heavily influenced by a few countries, those countries that have the largest economies specifically. And so that tends to be the United States, Western European countries, and our major trade partners. Yeah, so oftentimes the way the policies of the IMF or the World Bank end up being implemented, to some degree it reflects the political interests of those influential countries, like the United States. So you sort of have to think about this in two ways, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
The institution has its goals and objectives, but the institution is also influenced by its primary funders and influencers. So there is an interest, I think, among politicians in these large countries like the United States and Germany and France and United Kingdom and so on, to promote democracy. But often for their own national interests, in order to establish a reliable ally, or perhaps establish a reliable trade partner in a particular region. Donald Trump said over and over, America first, right? That was his theme, his slogan, America first. Well, to some degree, politicians from any country represent the interests of their country first because that's who they are supposed to represent. Yeah, and so it makes these international organizations sometimes complicated to understand or to maneuver because politicians have to or should be responding to their constituents. Yeah, so
would that then suggest, because you began on a note of saying that these international organizations take on an identity and character of their own, and one would hope that, like Sarah said, that democratic values are shared values. One would hope that as they take on that identity, it is rooted in the shared values of democracy. What then explains sometimes the uncoordinated movements? Is it the interest or is there more?
Yeah, I think to a large extent it's the interests of the member countries. It's also, I think all of these organizations are subject to popular politics, right? The way that American citizens or the way Africans or Europeans understand a particular situation, right? The way we interpret something that's happening also reflects up the chain to these organizations. And in addition to that, if it's the IMF we're talking about, for example, the way we think about the best policies, the best techniques to accomplish the mission of the IMF, that changes as economic theory or experience or major world events like the recession in 2008, 2009, or COVID, right? It changes the way we understand the world around us. And so those institutions will shift policies. But over the long term, if you look at it, it seems like we're going this direction and then that direction, and then we're changing directions again. And there are many factors that influence that, I think.
Okay, so...
But I could add one quick point there. Yes. On these international institutions. For me, the way I look at them, I mean, I've studied their formation, their statutes. These is like the IMF, the World Bank, and actually the World Bank and its agencies, like IMF and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. They were set up for completely different objectives. And they pursue those objectives without flinching. So if anybody expects that the World Bank and IMF are going to be worried about your democracy, about your freedom, that would really be expecting too much from them, because they are set for a completely different purpose. I actually normally, talk to colleagues in government, who do negotiate these agreements. I'm like, no, the World Bank and IMF are not here just to develop Uganda. They are here to do business. You have to start from that perspective. If they help in terms of economic development, it's a consequence of their business. It can't be the objective. No, because it's a bank is a bank. Whether it's world, whether it's a commercial bank. I think for me, I look at them as these are banks. They have a mission. They need to make money. And therefore, how you use it to promote your own country, to even build your democratic institutions, is dependent on you, not on the other institutions, in my view.
Thank you for that input, Godber. And that, if his analysis, which seems to agree with yours, is true, where then does an enthusiast of democracy at a global scale turn to? Because, for example, earlier on, we had good reviews for ECOWAS in West Africa, and that's a regional bloc. Now, at the international level, where one would expect a lot of leverage if you're an advocate for democracy, where then does one turn?
Turn to Big Brother.
Yeah, I'm hesitating because I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that. Yeah, the United States, for example, often talks about promoting democracy. But as we like to say, talk is cheap, right? So sometimes US policies have the effect of promoting democracy, but also in other cases, US policies have the effect of undermining democracy, depending on what represents the interests
So
of
the
the
economics
United States.
stupid, like.
Yeah, it's the same thing with economics. So maybe it's in the interests of the wealthy countries to help Uganda develop a program or to grow its economy or improve health outcomes. But maybe at other times it's not all that beneficial for Uganda. It's not beneficial to the United States, for example, for Uganda to grow its economy to the point that it becomes a competitor with the United States. And so, we would like to believe that sort of we're all in this together, democracies are all working together. And I think for democracies, it's easier to work together than for dictatorships, but it's not guaranteed that we share the same interests or that we can work together.
Okay, thank you very much. We are moving towards the end of this show, and I would like us to, towards the end now, do some sort of scorecard and also sort of suggesting a way forward. There are so many people who watch this show, especially young people, and a sense of, yes.
I think one element we have not looked at is the role of the UN and its sister agencies. Because if you look at the UN mechanism, the UN Security Council, which is more powerful. For example, as an ordinary citizen in this troubled country, I've always wondered why we should have permanent members of the UN Security Council. That's a permanent dictatorship at the topmost global, yes. And then the way they veto, and the way they act, especially look at the question, the unresolved question of Israel-Palestine.
Dr. Brian answered that,
No. Because if you look at, if we are talking of human rights as being universal, does that include the human rights of Palestinian people? And how come the UN, for all its existence, has failed to resolve that simple question of whether we should have independent states? I know that now Palestine has embassies and is trying, and there's a UN Committee on Palestine, but should it take this long for the world to ensure that the Palestinian people can also have peace in the country they wish to live in? Why?
But I think, Sarah, on the UN Security Council, again, you just have to look at the history. That,
After World War II.
Yeah, that this is a negotiated settlement after World War II. And, and the countries went and fought. I normally teach my law students, they say, if you have no economic power and you have no military power, you can always sing about sovereignty. But it doesn't mean much. Yeah? The mere fact that you say we are all sovereign states, equal sovereign states, that's in the context of political economy, that is not enough. So these guys fought the war, World War II, finished. The League of Nations had basically collapsed. It had failed to prevent the breakout of World War II. And after the war, they had to sit down again and construct the current global architecture, although now you've seen that there are changes. So all these institutions, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, they were all created around the same time as a new global order. And I think that for all intents and purposes, we have to congratulate the guys who sat, because for almost close to a century, they were able to maintain global peace and security. Yeah? By maintaining that balance of I would call it balance of terror, what we call the mutual assured destruction, MAD. That all these guys know that we have weaponry, each one of us can annihilate the other. Therefore, you don't do it. So that's That's the system that we created. I don't think that there are conditions now that changes that system. Because you see, Africa goes and says, we want to be on the Security Council. Then you ask yourself, but Africa, what are you taking there? Other than taking there, you are so many smaller countries, mainly poor, militarily weak. What are you taking there? So you don't have the negotiating
So should we leave
position.
it for the superpowers?
No, I keep on insisting. I say, you know, countries like Uganda, which are very rich, endowed, naturally endowed, it's like you can build a strong society. Because a country like Uganda, just saying you have sent your foreign minister to New York, that is not so, it's not very important. It's more about what are you doing, how are you connecting with the rest of the world in terms of commerce, in terms of trade, in terms of international relations, how are you connecting?
But Godber,
Yeah.
so if I can reduce that very example to the example of democracy within a country, if you agree with that argument of what would the country be taking to the Security Council, are you also not, in effect, agreeing with the suggestion, for example, that people who don't contribute to tax should not vote? That isn't the value of a human being inherent, and therefore the value of a nation or a country, if we have come together to coalesce around common interests, our value and equality.
Let me tell you, Abu, that one, if I was seated in a room creating an architecture for African Union, I would have to create standards because values set standards. I would have to create a threshold that a country must reach to be able to become a member of the African Union. So even within the countries, because you see the value of humanity is not just expressed in the vote. It's expressed in your ability to participate meaningfully
And your
in the
well-being.
democratic process and your well-being. Yeah. So I have argued time and again. I don't know why, you know, presidents like this African president that cannot educate their children, they can't provide health care. Then they are there at the World Economic Forum giving speeches.
They fly in private jets.
Yes, I would not allow any of these people. If you have kids that are not in school, your people are working on foot, and then you come to the World Economic Forum, what are you telling the world? So I would want a global order that have thresholds. People, you know,
Sanctions. And sanctions.
People, even us as individual human beings, you aspire. That's why we talk about who is your role model. It means that there is a threshold up there. You're saying, this is my role model. I want to work towards that. But when you get a crowd of all these people, you find someone in New York there at the UN General Assembly, working, talking, and abusing everybody. And at home, they can't feed their people. At home, the children can't go to school. At home, the citizens have no health care. So
Dead bodies are detained in hospitals.
Dead bodies are detained in hospital. So I think that I'm really, because as I said, I teach the law of sovereignty at the law school, and I look at this concept of sovereignty and statehood, and I say, you know, the political economy of international law has created a certain neutrality that also promotes mediocrity.
Wow. So, like I said earlier, I want us now to do some sort of scorecard. It can be agreed that there are some common principles that make up what is described as democracy. And so I would like us to sort of look at each of those principles, score this country, and possibly whoever is watching, help them understand what they entail as we move towards suggesting a way forward and ending this show. And the first one is this idea of free and fair elections. And I know that Godber, you participated very actively in the generation of the free and fair campaign. I don't know if you abandoned it or if the promoters of that campaign abandoned it. But so in not so many minutes, just help us as a tenet of democracy understand what free and fair elections are about and where we are falling short. In other words, what way forward we can hope for.
Yeah. No, so actually, because this is, again, when you talk in terms of threshold and standards, you look at our constitution, it basically prescribes the standard. The elections should be regular, free, and fair. So those concepts, you can begin to break them down. If you were interested in building a democratic society that is based on elections, you can break down those concepts, say what is regular. In our case, that is settled every 5 years. But what is free and what is fair? That is where we have failed. On those three strands, we have failed. And for for reasons that are inherent in our system. Because you see, for Uganda, you're talking about a country that has never experienced a peaceful transfer of power from one president to another, or from one political party to another. What you see right now, that we call election, is basically a deadly contest between NRM and opposition political groups. In fact, that the citizens are basically caught in the middle. Yeah, they are not the ones fighting. No, the citizens are caught in the middle of this deadly contest. And because the NRM people have the control of the state machinery, the instruments of coercion and violence, then they unleash all this violence on the population. So for me, I have actually, just to be very precise, I have argued time and again that one, this country cannot have a free and fair election as long as President Museveni is on the ballot. Because there are inherent structural limitations that make that possible. So as long as you have President Museveni on the ballot, you are guaranteed there is going to be violence. Because the security forces are constructed around his personality. One of the things I've been tracking is this thing of recruitment into the army. So when you go back to 1986, you'll find that if not all, the majority of the passing of the infantry trainees is presided over by the president. When it is senior command staff training, in most cases the CDF can go and preside over. In other cases, but for infantry, these recruits. Now, when you see he even preside over the police cadets, or I think he has even sometimes done on prisons, the president has to be there. So essentially, I don't know. In most cases, I don't think that we Ugandans understand the implications, what this means. So in other words, you can have, you are building a national force, a national military, but that is royal to an individual.
But he's the commander-in-chief for now.
It doesn't matter. You see, serious militaries.
Not a permanent.
Serious
title.
militaries are royal to the flag and to the country. Yeah. The commander-in-chief position is to say, yes, you are a commander-in-chief, but in the event that there's a conflict between you and the country, we will shift to that royalty. Because the royalty to country is paramount. It's the same debate I have had with the political party people. Because in this country, one of the problems that we have is that citizens are loyal to their party leader. So you'll find people in NRM who will die if Museveni is not president, or can threaten to die. Or some of them can threaten, the FDC people, there are people in FDC who can threaten to die if Dr. Besigye is mistreated in any way in FDC. And you can look at all these parties, all these party groups. Then the second one is that they are loyal to their parties. So you'll find someone saying, if you cut me here, I am blue, or my blood is yellow. It's basically meaning that these are their parties. And then Uganda comes last. And unless we reach a point where the population is so conscientized that it flips and say, my loyalty is first to Uganda, and then others follow, Ordinarily, the party leaders, they should be the last in terms of royalty. If Abu was the president of my party, and you do things that I think they are against my party principles and against my country, I have no business being loyal to you, because I am more institutional than individual. So in short, when we look at free and fair elections in this country, we have inherent distortions. I call it political brokenness that you cannot even. I don't think that you can actually. I think I've argued and I think I believe that I'm accurate, that the future that we desire as a generation can no longer be delivered through an election. It is going to have to be negotiated, because the brokenness of our institutions, of our politics, of our cultures is so deep that it is no longer, it's not, you know, when you have an election and it's a very deadly contest, people die because you are going to vote. As a people, you just have to think and say, are we really human enough? Should we be having election? Should there be an election exercise where you have the security forces of a country going on the streets shooting people, more or less like executing people extrajudicially? Is that an election? As a country, if we are civilized enough, that election we should reject completely and begin to think of other alternatives. But I actually think that the future of this country that we desire as a generation can only be negotiated. And among Ugandans, because normally the politicals want to assume that they are the ones who should sit and decide for us. No, I don't think that they can. It has to be a much broader spectrum of Ugandans to be able to negotiate and agree on more fundamental principles upon which Uganda as a democracy is built. What are those principles and values that are non-negotiable for us?
Yeah, so I'm really enjoying this and would love to go on, but we are cut for time. But just one final question. Isn't that what, among others, you attempted with the campaign for electoral reforms? Because you went around the country, tried to...
Yeah, but you see, I think Brian said it earlier. Democracy is not a product. Democracy is a process. It is fine-tuned along the way. As you build, you are building, you are trying to entrench those democratic principles, and you are building the pillars of democracy, the institutions, what we call elections governing bodies, like the Electoral Commission, the police, and other institutions. You are building them. So you are building the resilience of your democracy to be able to withstand shocks. So for me, I see the work that we've done right from the constitutional amendment, the making of the 1995 Constitution, the Free and Fair Elections campaign, the work I did with the Democratic Alliance, and the work we've done under people power, although NUP seemed to shift the conversation from people power. But I think that the work we did under people power and the age limit debate, I think that those are the ingredients of building. The fight that we're engaged in right now is not because our democracy has failed. It's because we are engaged in systematic democratic reversals. Okay. You can look on the horizon and say, instead of building forward in terms of building the democratic culture, democratic institutions, we are actually reversing. We have dismantled the Constitution. We have made life less significant, that it's okay to kill people, and the president goes on TV and says, we didn't kill so many, so it's okay. You know, it's very disturbing when in the 21st century, a president can go on TV and say, the other one who died, we thought he was not ours. Actually, the problem is that he was ours. You know, it's so disturbing. When you are thinking that you're actually advancing in civilization, then you begin to see that actually probably you are retrogressing. And the mere fact that the population accepts this is probably a part of part of our fundamental problem that we have to address.
Thank you, Godber. Allow me to go to Sarah. And Sarah, because of time, I'm going to sort of combine these tenets, because the other that we are going to look at is the rule of law and the respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. And I think we can deal with this concurrently. Scorecard, where are we and which way?
But before you take me to number 2, yes, on the question of free and fair elections, yes, you know, I think we have reached a time as a country where we feel we need to define even what is an election, so that when we have exercises that fall below a minimum threshold of what is expected of an election, then nobody should claim that they are an outcome of an election.
Yeah.
So we need to have that conversation in this country. Because we have a crisis of legitimacy in this country, we have, you know, lost all human shame when it comes to greed for power. Even if it means killing villages and villages of people. Some people are reckless to that extent that they can slash human beings just to keep themselves in power. So we need to have that conversation of what constitutes an election. And once any of those elements are missing, then don't claim that there was an election in Uganda. Because we can as well do with a coup. I think some countries are better off. If you consider the events, if we make a recollection of events in Kampala of November 18th and 19th, the parents that lost their children. Because I think most of the people who were shot were between the ages of 18 and 25. Yeah. The people that lost their children at that prime age. Yeah. So how do you tell them that you can exercise your right to participate in your democracy? So we need to have these conversations. They are difficult, but we cannot run away from them.
No, we can't.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you bring out a very critical question of legitimacy.
Yes.
But also, Sarah, I mean, I always refer to people in 2016 elections, the aftermath of the elections, the way the military took over Kampala. That was no less than a coup.
Yeah, because actually what is the
that
difference
was no less than a coup.
between elections in Uganda and a coup?
military coup?
Because if you compare with Guinea, which has just had a coup, how many people were shot? I don't remember. But compare with Kampala. So what is an election?
Okay, so thank you, Sarah, for that perspective. Maybe now we can square the rule of law and human rights possible. I don't know whether, you know, these things cannot even be compartmentalized, but maybe for purposes of just appreciating democracy.
You know, if you look at the principles for rule of law, basically it's a tool that everybody is equal before the law, and you must accord everyone due process. I think that is a summary of the rule of law. And then beyond that, you can look at institutions. So do we have strong institutions which can put their feet down and say, we need due process, we need equality before the law? As much as we have some semblance of judicial freedom in this country, because I know, Matanda, you are engaged in judicial activism. I think you have a number of petitions pending before courts of law.
And they will be pending
some
for a
of
while.
them, depending on the political implications, some of them are intentionally not determined in time in which they are supposed to make impact. So that by the time you get your ruling, it is overtaken by events and it is is of academic purpose.
Yes, exactly. You've helped those students.
Yes, and the building on that jurisprudence. But most of the, and over time, because of the limited political space and civic space, political questions and important citizens' questions of the day are finding themselves in court. Because you cannot have them resolved through the parliamentary mechanism, through the local government mechanism, through these democratic leadership spaces. So all our political arguments are now before courts of law. And then you have a case. Let me use a simple case of the Public Order Management Act, a law that was deliberately enacted, violating Article 92 of the Constitution. Everybody was put on notice, including the Attorney General, including the Parliamentary Drafting Council, including MPs, both at plenary level and committee level, to say that our Constitution, and it is written in simple language, that you cannot enact a law aimed at defeating a court judgment.
Yeah.
So there is a court judgment in Mwanga Chuvumbi case saying police has no powers in this country to authorize or deny permission to assemble. So you have these people enacting a law, then you even remind them that there is a court judgment unchallenged by the constitutional court of this country, saying no power, constitution does not give police such powers. It's unconstitutional. But you go ahead and pass this law to defeat a court judgment. We challenge it again in courts of law, and the decision came after 10 years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, doesn't that define the status of rule of law in this country?
And I think a decision also came because the person who is the author of the law wants to organize public gatherings.
Yeah. Okay.
I think to me that summarizes really the status of rule of law. You have a constitution, you have a constitutional court decision, you have a parliament blatantly violating the constitution, and you run to constitutional court again, and the decision comes after a decade.
And I think that's why we've said that
On a key tenet of freedom of assembly,
what we have
association, and expression.
What we have now is what we call rule by law, not the rule of law. Rule by law means that if there is anything that inconveniences you, you enact a law to make it legal. Yeah? Rule of law means that everybody follows the law without discrimination. Everybody is equal before the law. But if you have a law that says, oh, you can't contest when after you are 75 years old, then you enact a law to remove it. You make it illegal to contest for elections. If you want to degazette a forest, and the law says you can't degazette a forest, you then could enact a law and say it is illegal to degazette forest. That's called rule by law.
Wow, thank you. Fundamental freedoms, fundamental human rights and freedoms.
Well, we had a president at one time, the late Idi Amin Dada, who made a remarkable statement that you have freedom to say what you want to say, but I can guarantee you freedom. So you have freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee you freedom after speech.
Did he actually say that? Okay.
But I will use the other.
Sarah is saying that because the man is not here to defend himself.
No, but I've also
But
read
it's a common saying.
I was very young. I've also read it.
Yeah.
I've found it as part of history of Uganda.
Yeah.
Because I was about 2 years old or 3 when Idi Amin was removed. So I cannot say I heard him say it.
Yeah.
So I will use the yardstick of freedom of association, assembly, and freedom as exposed by Voltaire, saying that I might not agree with what you want to say, but I will die ensuring that you say that I don't agree with. I think really, so we have people who have hijacked, because we are under state capture. We have people who have hijacked institutions of state to make sure you don't say that they don't want to hear. And that is the status. I think that's how I will sum it up on the status of freedoms of assembly, expression, and association. When it comes to right to life, you know, we have people who were murdered just in the last elections. November and 18th, 19th killings. We have a documentary by BBC showing police pickups with their number plates, murdering people, open shooting.
Yeah. Executions, actually.
Executions on Kampala streets. And no action.
Yeah.
Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been suspended. These people still put on a uniform of citizens. And most of them were promoted.
To
Because the one case that I would never want us to remember is the one of Kasese.
Yes, of course.
Yeah?
I was just using
The massacre in Kasese, that you can get a nation's military just attack a palace of people they say they just have machetes, and you destroy it.
planning to overthrow government with
Yes,
a few machetes.
with pangas and hoes and whatever. You destroy it, kill over 100 people, and then keep more than 100 women and young people in jail for 4 years without trial. Now, if you want to see,
Are they still in jail?
Oh, they were released to go and vote in the last election.
But the charges are still there.
No,
the
they were.
Mumbere is still facing charges?
No, the man next to God forgave them.
Including the king.
No, I think the king is still incarcerated. That one still has to first behave himself. Yeah, but so in other words, when you're talking about freedom and the rule of law, you are basically you would be talking about actually the epitome of freedom the epitome of rule of law is that the very people who are supposed to enforce the law subject themselves to the law. That's really the epitome. If you allow me, I'll just share with you one quote here, which I find quite interesting. So this is a quote by one-time US President James Madison, 1978. He basically said, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Now, in our particular case, we have a government that can't control itself. So that's basically the tragedy that we have, and that's why you cannot say we have the rule of law. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Dr. Brian, I don't know how much you can speak to the context of Uganda. You have been here, but there are things like access to information, things like rule of law, things like fundamental rights and freedoms, things like free and fair elections. If you can help us maybe contextualize them, how does Uganda compare with the United States in your eyes?
Yeah, so let me begin, and I think we're coming to the end of our time here,
Yes.
by going back to where Godber started with the philosophers, political philosophers. A philosopher named Thomas Hobbes talked about the idea of a leviathan, a powerful force that could govern and control countries. And he wrote and he worried that any entity, any government, any individual that could be powerful enough to control a country would be too powerful for the country to control. And since Hobbes, many other philosophers and politicians have talked about this idea. And how do we find the balance? On the one hand, we want a government that has the power to collect taxes, to enforce the law, prevent crime, have an effective court system to protect rights. On the other hand, we have to have some way to prevent that government from stomping on the small people who disagree. When we talk about democracy, we tend to talk about free and fair elections. But the point of the free and fair elections is for the people to chain the Leviathan, to chain the government, and make sure that it is actually representing the interests of the people.
The social contract.
Yeah, exactly, the social contract. So how do you do that? You have to have citizens who are active in politics, who are willing to pay the price to demand that the government represent their interests. First of all, every citizen has to have information, complete information about policies, politicians, their backgrounds, how much money they're getting from the government, right, for their work in government. Every citizen who wants to vote must be able to vote. If you don't have a situation where everybody can get access to open information about politics, then it's very difficult to have free and fair elections. You don't have free and fair elections. So I'm not an expert on Ugandan politics, but that's sort of the standard, the criteria to develop a scorecard on democracy. And without democracy, without those institutions in place, it becomes very difficult to make advancements on human rights or individual liberties or the rule of law.
Thank you very much. We need to wrap this up now. I'm going to allow each one of you about a minute to just conclude. It can be anything, something you think has not come out.
Okay. Okay. And I was worried about anything.
It could be appreciation to the people on the cameras. Yes, Godber.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, my colleagues and yes, and the people behind the camera. No, for me, I would want to just conclude by saying that one, the International Democracy Day is a ritual. All these days, one of the things that the UN has done is almost take away every day for something. So there is International Democracy Day, there is International Women's Day, there is International Day of the Elder Day, International Environmental Day. I find it quite intriguing, and so if you were to say I am dedicating each day for each of the things that the UN has prescribed, you'd find that in a year of 365 days, you are meaning with a few days. So I am seeing these are rituals. So they can only be given meaning by the citizens. So in other words, while we can say, because even for the International Democracy Day, I'm not sure whether as Uganda, no, we can't be celebrating it because we have, I think, given the democratic reversals that we have experienced since the adoption of the 1995 Constitution, we can't be celebrating. Maybe if there's any difference between celebrating and commemorating, I would say maybe we are commemorating. But I think what a day like this one should do should be to inspire people to be able to fight for democracy. Because democracy, you fight for it. It is not delivered on a silver platter. Every gain in a democratic process, it is fought for by the citizens. I think that in this country, there has been a deliberate attempt by the regime in power now to create the maximum amount of fear in everybody, to make every simple fight, even the simplest of the fights, very risky. And people seem to disengage. So what you're seeing is that the citizens disengage because it is very risky. But what is more frustrating is that the people who are civic conscious, who are civic competent, who should be the ones at the front lines of fighting for democracy, and this here I mean the private sector people who have money, who should be financing, democracy, civic education programs. I mean professionals like lawyers, like doctors, like engineers, like accountants. They have all more or less like disengaged or completely opted out. And I think that our biggest challenge as a country now, or as pro-democracy activists and fighters, is how do we get these groups to re-engage and then begin to talk about the future? Because right now, there is a substantial disengagement. As Brian said, the risks here for doing the kind of work that Sarah and I and others do is very high. In other cases, like we've seen guys who are active in active partisan politics, the risk is death. So that's how risky it is. So I think that on a day like this one, we need to challenge ourselves and say, how do we draw the people who have disengaged, especially among these professionals? How do we turn around the church leaders who have now almost become the enablers of the dictatorship, that we can be able to challenge them? As Christians and Muslims, we challenge our religious leaders and say, you are playing more with the leopard than the citizens whom you are supposed to fend for. So that is really the crux of our challenge, and it is no mean challenge.
Thank you very much, Godber. Sir.
Well, I want to first of all associate with the comments made by Godber, but add to maybe major issues on democracy. For the citizens, we have no other country to call our home. So giving up is not any of the options available to us. This is our country, so nobody should have or even have a dream that they are going to give up on Uganda. Because where we are, we as a nation, we are at the top of the cliff. So when you are at the top of the cliff, so you need to make sure that you can descend to a safer place, because falling off is not an option you want to take. So we shouldn't allow our country to fall off that cliff, steep cliff. And to the leaders or duty bearers in this country, the well-being of any nation is seen from the way you treat your vulnerable people. Let me just use one quick example that we are all now, that is fresh in our minds. During lockdown, because of COVID pandemic, the state attempted to take people to vulnerable, to the most vulnerable. They selected 60 families. So I think those were like the wretched of the earth, of our society. Because we have 8.3 million people
who are poor, below the
who are
poverty line.
classified as poor,
Yeah.
living below the minimum threshold for one to survive. So out of 8.3 million people, you choose 560 to give them money for 42 days, 100,000 shillings. According to findings by Parliament, this money did not even reach a third of the intended beneficiaries. So that demonstrates to anybody the institutionalization of corruption in this country and the way we treat our most vulnerable people. Very pathetic. It would be unheard of in any country that claims to be normal. So I think that
in any country governed by a government that claims to be normal, because the country is normal.
No. These are very abnormal things.
Yeah.
You have, among the people that were intended to receive are child-headed families.
Yeah.
And then the people sit and eat this small money, 100,000.
Yeah.
We have reached the situation, the deterioration of service delivery. And these are middle-income families who can afford to go to private hospitals. But half of the people that have lost their lives in private hospitals, dead bodies are detained because they cannot cover bills to be able to bury their loved ones in peace. So if you think that you are okay, actually COVID has exposed the vulnerability of the Uganda's middle class. Because it's not poor people being detained in these hospitals. It is the middle class. It is the rich.
The working class.
So nobody's safe. Nobody's safe. So we need to all work and make sure we descend from the top of the cliff as a nation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Dr. Brian, your parting shot.
Yes, thank you.
You can give us the formula of how we descend.
So first, let me say it's a pleasure to be here among some very distinguished colleagues. It's an honor, and thank you to the crew behind the cameras. On in January, in the United States, we had a crisis, right? Perhaps,
That's January 6th.
yes, January 6th, perhaps the greatest threat to democracy in over 200 years for the United States. And after that day, a story began to circulate widely that when those politicians who wrote the original Constitution of the United States in 1788, 1789, when they came out of the meeting, the final meeting, the citizens were waiting outside and they said, "What kind of government do we have?" The politicians said, "A democracy if you can keep it."
Yeah. Yeah. So long as you can't defend it.
Yeah. But the democracy that they created didn't allow women to vote. It didn't allow any ethnic minorities to vote. In fact, you had to be a white man who owned land to vote. Today, we wouldn't think of that as a democracy, but over time, Americans have fought for the advancement of democracy. And so, again, going back to this idea of democracy as a product, it's false. Democracy is a process. And so I would encourage Ugandans to think of it in those terms. It's step-by-step, small advancements that you get the form of government that you want to govern your country.
And you keep it.
And you keep it through work, because it can slide away very easily.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brian. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Godber. What can I add? We have had it all. We interrupted our normal programming of the Youth Roundtable to commemorate the International Day of Democracy. We hope that what we sought to achieve has been achieved. We thought it would be important for us to take stock of democracy, and you can be sure that we are going to come back to this conversation again. I want to ask you to engage with the ideas shared here as usual. If you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please subscribe and click on that bell for you to get notifications. We are very active on Twitter, on Facebook. As these conversations happen, you keep ideating, share with us those ideas. Sometimes they come in form of questions, sometimes they come in form of comments. We also want to grow and improve. If you have suggestions on how that can happen, we are happy to hear. Thank you for sticking with us for more than 2 hours. We wish you the best. See you next week.